Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, outsourcing. Lots of companies do it because it's cheaper to get stuff done overseas where labour is cheaper. But isn't that damaging to the economy? Doesn't it take jobs away and create unemployment? Well, you might think so, but unemployment is pretty low everywhere right now. So does that mean we just create other stuff and it ultimately leads to more productivity? Or is it something we need to do something about, like President Trump is trying to do with tariffs and protectionism? That's this time on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, most Western companies outsource their manufacturing overseas, often to China. So you've got companies like Apple and Nike. Walmart, apparently, works with 10,000 different manufacturing plants in various parts of China. And why wouldn't they, of course? Because it's cheaper. So there's no downsides for the company in doing that. There's just downside for the economy.
Yeah, this is something which I had actually analysed way back before I became an academic, back in, I think it was, 1987 or something like that nature, 84, looking at the whole issue of the relocation of production. Because the fundamental outsourcing, there's two types of outsourcing. There's a company that says, we're a car company. Why do we have a computing wing? Let's outsource our computing functions to IBM and we'll just do the car manufacturing.
Yeah.
That's one side. The outsourcing you're talking about right now is relocating production, saying we're
cheaper labor. Yeah.
Okay, we're retailers. We're selling stuff to the public. We don't have to make it ourselves. We can make it overseas and bring it in more cheaply. And that was the secret of China's industrialization from with the Gang of 4 days, with 1989, 90, 91. You had the Gang of 4 kicked out after Mao's death. Deng Xiaoping back in power. The cat philosophy, it doesn't matter what color a cat is, black or white, as long as it catches mice. Let's industrialize as fast as possible. And then going for export-oriented industrialization at the time when the Chinese workforce, I have no idea what the actual pay rates were, but it's something of the order of what was a pay rate for a American worker for a day would be a pay rate for a Chinese worker for a month. And there was such a huge cost advantage to American companies relocating their production to China and then exporting it back for sale in America. But masses and masses of did it, even though the Chinese required them. And this is a unique Chinese policy. No other developing country has done this. It required them to have a Chinese partner, regardless of the amount of capital they started. Within 5 years, the Chinese partner had to own half the business. Now, that to me gives you an idea of just how attractive the wage differential was for American corporations to agree to that anyway.
Interesting now, Chinese companies, because they do, have a developing domestic economy as well, and that domestic economy is demanding quality goods, and they're willing to pay for it, but the companies making it for the domestic economy obviously want it to be as cheap as possible, so they're looking to countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh and Botswana and Ethiopia and the Philippines. So as China's domestic economy grows, they are starting to outsource themselves as well, and so it goes on.
Yeah, but there's a bit of a limit that the Chinese Communist Party won't let go as far as the American the political scene has, and that is you don't want the Chinese to revolt. Because, I was in China in 81, 82, one of the very informative experiences in my life, when I took a bunch of journalists there for a conference with Chinese journalists. But as part of it, we happened to be in China during the finals of the women's volleyball competition. And the final was won by China against Japan. And there was an edict from the Communist Party saying, do not demonstrate in Tiananmen Square. Well, the journalists that I was with knew that they'd ignore that. And we went down there and saw roughly, I think, about a million people on bicycles celebrating and letting off crackers and so on in Tiananmen Square. Now, that's the positive side of a demo. The negative side, where there were so many strikes and demonstrations and revolts during the financial crisis because Chinese exports fell by something like 40%. And the impact of this was, first of all, factories would downsize as they do anywhere else in the world. But in China, when you lost your job, you were normally unable to get Social Security instead because you're registered. This is a bit of a hangover of the communist days. You're registered in your place of birth. It's very hard to change it, which would be some province in the west of the country. So something in the order of 50 million Chinese found themselves hopping on trains to go back to the countryside they'd left 10 or 20 years earlier. They weren't happy. and the demonstrations went through the roof. And that's a major reason why the Chinese stimulus was so big. Now, extrapolating a bit forward, if there's a scale of relocation of production that means you start getting unemployed Chinese workers, then I expect demonstrations to come along that the Communist Party will respond to. Whereas in America, they couldn't give a rat's ass about what the working class thinks. And that's why you ultimately get the working class voting for Trump, because the policy of relocation of production goes on regardless of the opinions of American workers.
And because there are so many Chinese workers, there's this idea of low-cost labor is going to carry on forever, isn't it? So even if you have hotspots within China, I think this is starting to happen as well. Some places are getting more expensive, so they are moving production facilities inland to other places where the labor is cheaper. And so, and you can do that, goodness knows, hundreds of times over, because there's so many places in China, such a big population. We're never going to run short of low-cost labor in that part of the world.
No, I think they've certainly done a huge amount of absorbing it. I mean, they really are. Australia is the manufacturing hub for the planet these days, outside of countries like Germany that hung onto their own manufacturing as well. And then Japan. But they have played a massive role, and it is having an impact. There are, wages have risen in general, not just for manufacturing workers. I've been to China a few times. I've been to quite a few towns in China. And when you look at the standard of living that people are enjoying there, it doesn't feel too different to a middle-class American town. In fact, it feels a lot better frequently because you don't see as many homeless.
Unless they get shot.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are political sects and religions you shouldn't belong to in China for your own health. Yes, so I do take that point. But the level of prosperity is quite high. I think it's understated by. If you look at the comparison in terms of renminbi or yuan to the American dollar, it looks like the Chinese aren't anywhere near as well off. I think certainly the average Chinese in the third tier and above towns is doing pretty well, except those working in some of the sweatshops. So complicated answer, but I think it's not as possible to do that relocation within China anymore. And that's why a lot of Chinese companies are outsourcing. Right. I'm seeing Bangladesh turning up on plenty of the clothing labels I see these days, and equally Vietnam.
So what about the impact of all this outsourcing on Western countries? We'll explore that more in the full version of this podcast. And to hear that, you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen and pledge $10 or more support to Steve's work, and you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.